The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've told you story after story on this program of African-American crime suspects being stopped, frisked, shot, tased, beaten by police. And we've also talked about many individual stories going beyond just the broader statistics of disproportionate application of law enforcement techniques. We talked about the young black football player who was shot after being in a car accident running for help. We've talked about the countless African Americans who, when unarmed or otherwise complying, get shot, sometimes once, sometimes 5 times, sometimes as many as 30, 40, or 50 times. I want to tell you a very, very different story today. This is the story of a 19-year-old former high school field hockey star who plowed a BMW into 3 other cars, fled from the scene of an accident, multiple accidents, and kicked a police officer in the head before being apprehended in Bensalem, Pennsylvania, just a few days ago in the morning. Not only does this perpetrator happen to be white, but she also happens to be a woman. This is, according to WPVI Channel 6, Sarah Culhane from Princeton, New Jersey, who was arrested after 3 reported hit-and-run accidents after she assaulted an officer who was trying to arrest her. Bensalem police were called to the scene of an accident around 9:30 in the morning. They arrived in time to see the blue BMW, which had already been involved in 1 at-fault accident, drive off. Police decided, they initially pursued the vehicle, and we can't say because they saw the characteristics of the suspect, but after seeing who the suspect was and what the car was, decided to call off the pursuit to avoid a high-speed chase. Okay, decision that police made. The BMW subsequently struck a second vehicle at an intersection and injured 1 woman, then drove away from that second scene of the crime, leaving the scene of an accident twice after 2 at-fault accidents, before striking a 3rd vehicle and coming to arrest. Police say that then Culhane fled the vehicle and tried to evade police, and according to NBC Channel 10, once police actually caught up with her, she kicked a police officer in the head and resisted arrest to a significant degree after the suspected commission of multiple felonies, leaving the scenes of accidents. Culhane and the injured woman were taken to a medical center nearby. Culhane was the breakout field hockey star, currently attends Amherst College, right down the road from the original home of the David Pakman Show in Massachusetts, one of the top colleges in the country. First and foremost, I'm not doing this story because I wish that she had been shot by the police, or I wish that she had been tased by the police. My problem should be very clear, and it's this. Sarah Culhane did things that under other circumstances and to many other suspects, typically they are not female, and very, very often they are not white, would have gotten them at minimum, Lewis, beaten and tased, if not shot. And that did not happen here. I'm glad when police don't have to shoot the suspects they're pursuing, but we see time and time again, anecdotally and in the statistics, the disproportionate application of force depending on, or at least correlating with, the race of the suspect. And the class, let's not forget as well.
Right, and then there's the other half, which is what happens afterwards with prosecution and in the judicial system. And there seems to be some serious discrepancies there, too.
No question about it. And this is when we think about white privilege and the caricature of white privilege, which is white people get down on their knees and apologize to black people. That's the caricature from Bill O'Reilly. It's not real. What it really is when you commit a crime like this, if you're white in the U.S., where Caucasians are a majority, the race is not a lens through which this story is seen. None of the local news, the NBC 10 article, the WPVI article, none of them mention the race of the individual. Typically, the race of the suspect is mentioned when it is not white. So, Lewis, what we have left is, I would guess, a relatively light sentence. Maybe the emotional status of the suspect at the time will become a factor, often something that's not considered when it's not a middle class or upper middle class white girl. This story tells a piece of the story of the difference between being white and not being white in the U.S. when it comes to dealing with law enforcement and the judicial system.
I think this story is a great way to highlight that. And I can't imagine that unless she had completely lost her mind. I can't imagine you hitting 3 different cars and continuing on your way. Probably someone without any scruples or morals, or someone who temporarily lost their mind.
The United States Air Force, which is a branch of the American military, has quietly changed a rule which now requires any member of the Air Force to swear an oath to God in order to be part of the Air Force. There's an atheist airman at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada who was denied re-enlistment at the end of August for refusing to take an oath containing the phrase, "So help me God," which has been reported widely now by the American Humanist Association and by other media outlets. There's a September 2nd letter to the Inspector General for the Air Force and Creech, Monica Miller, who is an attorney for the AHA, says that the airman absolutely should be allowed to re-enlist without being forced to say, "So help me God." According to the AHA, the airman was told, "We cannot accept your contract because you crossed out the part that says, 'So help me God.'" The airman was told, "Your options at this point are you sign a new copy of this contract with the 'So help me God' part intact without adjustment, and you verbally recite an oath to God, or you leave the Air Force. Full stop. That's it." According to the American Humanist Association, this is completely unconstitutional and it's flatly unacceptable. Miller from the AHA says, "The government cannot compel a non-believer to take an oath that affirms the existence of a supreme being. Numerous cases affirm that atheists have the right to omit theistic language from enlistment or re-enlistment contracts." This was changed, Lewis. The Air Force Instruction 362606 spells out the enlistment oath. It initially said that there is the option to remove the "So help me God" part. That now is no longer there. The new documentation from the Air Force on this now just says that this is what it is. You say, "So help me God." Lewis, if you join the Marines, you should have to swear an oath to Pinocchio. Or if you join the Navy, it's Poseidon. Or if you join the police, it's an oath to, I don't know, the late great actor from the Naked Gun movies, Leslie Nielsen. I mean, this is just ridiculous. And I agree that it's probably unconstitutional. Not being an expert on this, we will ultimately see whether it is or is not.
Yeah, I don't need to tell people this shouldn't be happening, but I wonder why it is that the Air Force seems to be the most religious of all the military branches.
This is not because we did that other story, Lewis, where there was some kind of a religious test, or in other words, if you weren't religious and you answered questions on a certain assessment, honestly, you were essentially going to be at a disadvantage for selection. I think that's what it was, right, Lewis?
Something along those lines, yeah. And that was also Air Force, right?
Yeah. An American religious army is no better than the religious fighters that we oppose from other countries. Yes, I know, that's a different religion. But if we are going to have a secular and proper civil army, religion cannot be part of that, period. There is nothing else to add to that. Very, very interesting video from a Christian pastor who has offered atheists $100,000 to prove that God doesn't exist. I've done an initial review of this video, and then I have done subsequent detailed reviews of the video, and I can come to only one conclusion, that this pastor is completely ignorant, and that there is really very little going on between his ears. I'm going to play the first 20 or 25 seconds of this. This is all we're going to need to evaluate this amazing challenge to atheists. This is Christian pastor Joshua Feuerstein. Interesting, Feuerstein, typically a Jewish last name, but no, indeed, this is an evangelical Christian pastor who apparently lives in a bubble. Here was his challenge to atheists.
What's up, Josh Feuerstein here. So I'm here to issue the $100,000 atheist challenge to anybody that could provide me proof or evidence that God does not exist. I think it's rather ridiculous that there's been people for a long time that have said that God does not exist, and yet they're unarmed because they have zero evidence and zero proof. How would that ever hold up in a court of law?
We don't need to see the last 3.5 minutes of the video, Lewis, because when you see these first 19 seconds, you see that he doesn't even know what he's talking about. First of all, atheism is not a set of beliefs that say God does not exist and that we can prove that. It is a lack of belief in God. I mean, quite literally, the word atheist means without a God, without a deity. The reason that atheists haven't yet presented evidence that proves that God does not exist is because that's not a claim that I've ever heard an atheist make.
Yeah, I mean, it goes both ways as well. It's pretty much impossible for this guy to prove that God does exist.
Well, but then we have to talk about the burden of proof, right? And this is where it really gets crazy. He goes on to say, if atheists made this case in a court of law, it would never stand. And he fundamentally must not understand what the justice system is in this country. If you go to court, the state has to prove that you did kill someone, right? You don't go up there and say, whoa, whoa, whoa. The state alleges I killed someone, and now I, as the defendant, have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I didn't. That's not the way it works. The state has to prove that you did kill someone, in the same way that if you believe that there is this specific God who also had his emissary, Jesus Christ, you are the one who has to prove that, Lewis.
Right. I've watched this guy. I think this is the same guy as the whole Christ is King thing. And I've seen videos from this guy before. And basically his answer for why we are the way we are and why everything is the way it is because God and because Jesus. It's kind of like because America and because freedom. It's just this blind faith.
By his definition, fairies exist unless an anti-fairy activist can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they don't with evidence. Transparent gorillas that also have no mass because they circle the planet invisibly, but they have no mass, so they don't affect the orbits of anything around them. Those exist, Lewis, unless the anti-transparent gorilla movement can prove to us beyond a reasonable doubt that they don't exist. That's essentially what the brilliant pastor is saying. I would be curious whether he even has the $100,000 for atheists, but that's kind of a separate question.
Well, a lot of these evangelical pastors really rake it in, Dave.
Maybe he is a prosperity pastor. If you're going to challenge atheists, at least understand what atheism asserts or doesn't assert. The idea that atheism is a religion in the same way that Christianity is like saying not collecting basketball cards is the same type of hobby as collecting basketball cards. And I think that goes over the heads of a lot of these people.
Yeah, this guy is really a piece of work. I can't tell if he's actually passionate about this or if he's just trying to infuriate everyone on the internet with his videos.
We sometimes report good things or bad things from different countries around the world, and we recently reported on the great decision in the United Kingdom from the BBC to stop doing the 50-50 false equivalency controversial storyline on climate change. There is nothing really controversial if you look at the science of climate change, and BBC decided very proactively, we are not going to present it as such. By the way, CNN could probably take a little bit of a guide from that. Fox News could take some guidance from that, MSNBC, etc. We have another good thing coming to us from the UK, which is that in an attempt to check religious extremism in public schools, the British Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, said that schools that teach biblical creationism would be refused government funding. And in a statement delivered in Parliament, Morgan condemned the preaching of religious views within British public schools. This is a quote from the British Education Secretary. There has been no evidence of direct radicalization or violent extremism, but there is a clear account in the report of people in positions of influence in these schools with a restricted and narrow interpretation of their faith who have not promoted fundamental British values and who have failed to challenge the extremist views of others. Brilliantly put, succinct, accurate, salient. However, if you present that same statement to many of those who want religion in school, religion in government in the US, they would say, oh no, Lewis, she's wrong when she says that the fundamental values don't include this because the US is a Christian nation, and they will say that until they are blue in the face.
The same is true over there. It's kind of nice to know that we're not the only ones struggling with this type of thing. There's certainly plenty of fundamentalist nuts over there as well.
The Secretary of Education also connecting biblical creation to radical Islam. This is a comparison, an equation that has made a lot of people very, very angry. The reality, though, is that we're talking about shades of gray. And in the U.S., just have them, anybody who's upset about this comparison in the U.K., come to the U.S., and you will very quickly see that the types of restrictions that the religious right wants to impose on individuals when it comes to the imposition of prayer or religious teaching in public or involved in government, restricting LGBT rights, restricting abortion access, etc., etc. This is the same type of mentality that exists in Muslim theocratic states and regimes. So you can argue about the degree, you can argue about whether, well, Christianity used to be more violent, now it's Islam that's more violent in its physical sense. You can have those shades of gray, but there's definitely something salient, Lewis, that needs to be looked at in that equation.
Regardless of beliefs on either side in either religion, when you boil it down, the methods of indoctrination on the young and on those who are susceptible to it are exactly the same on both sides.
The U.S. needs to pay attention to this. Unfortunately, if a lot of people in the U.S. started paying attention, their only conclusion would be that Britain is evil. So that's sad. Let's take a break. Great program for you today, including a great interview with Dr. Gad Saad.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com, because when reality doesn't live up to right-wing ideals, there's only one possible explanation. Reality itself suffers from liberal bias. Check out liberalbias.com for more. Today's new member of the day is Rebecca Capeless. Rebecca, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. And joining Rebecca in the membership 4-year Hall of Fame is Claire Higgins Lewis, the former mayor of Northampton, Massachusetts, where we got our start. She was one of the first political elected officials who we interviewed on the program, and she now is part of the Membership Hall of Fame, completing 4 years as a David Pakman Show member. Also, Michael Carson. Michael Carson is a new member. Michael, we were getting your voicemails. You're telling us you haven't gotten your password for your membership stuff. Every time you leave us a voicemail, we email you that information. So it's probably going to spam. We've sent you 10 emails, and I'm just mentioning it here again. Please check your spam folder. We just emailed you earlier today. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, to do this kind of business on the air, but we have no way of getting a hold of Michael Carson, Lewis. I don't know what else to say.
Got to do it here. Yeah, it's quick. We're done. That's it.
You can, of course, support the program by doing your Amazon shopping through the Amazon banner at davidpakman.com. Click it, bookmark it, use it when you shop. Amazon sends us a kickback. We talked last week about really expensive textbooks. It is the start of a new college semester. The most expensive, and I would call it overpriced, textbook of the week is Mass Media Law at $145.87, Lewis. A little bit cheaper than the $160 ripoff from last week. But it's just insane. And I spoke to people who hadn't purchased books for this semester, but they said they've had $220 individual textbooks for college courses.
Unbelievable. I don't remember the most I ever paid for a book, but it certainly wasn't that much.
Also, a lot of people buying avocado and macadamia oil, Lewis. Have you heard of this trend now, cooking with these other oils, which apparently, here's what I've heard, right? Olive oil is good for you, but you don't want to cook with olive oil at high heat because it is bad and it can develop possibly even carcinogens. So if you want a healthy high heat oil, there are some alternatives. And I don't know if macadamia and avocado are some of the high heat ones or not, but there's this whole new trend now, Lewis, and new oils for cooking.
It seems like there's an oil for everything. I don't know. I mean, I don't know anything about them really. I'm old school. I just use grapeseed oil for high heat and maybe some coconut oil, but mostly olive oil.
All right. Well, Lewis laying down the law and seriously drawing a line in the sand. He is not going to fall for these new fad oils the last thing you'll see in Lewis's kitchen is an overpriced bottle of macadamia oil. Is that fair to say?
You will never see that in my kitchen unless it's free, unless someone gives it to me as a gift.
There has been a lot of criticism of President Obama amidst the recent news of the beheadings going on involving ISIS in the Middle East. And Eric Boehlert from Media Matters wrote a really interesting article pointing out that when the beheadings were happening under George W. Bush, the country needed to come together. We all need to work together. George W. Bush and any blame that he might bear for those beheadings never even came up, was never even mentioned. But now, under President Obama, the same usual suspects are blaming Obama for the beheading. So he writes that if you look back at when the George W. Bush beheadings were going on, and by that I don't mean beheadings done by George W. Bush or that George W. Bush was beheading, but simply that George W. Bush was president at the time, Bill O'Reilly said, for example, back in 2004, it's becoming readily apparent that the United States, we the people, have to unite. If we don't unite, we're going to see this happen more and more, and then on a mass scale, referring to the beheadings. We've got to stop this partisan garbage because that's what it is. We have to stop with the selfishness. This is a war. Sean Hannity, back in 2004, speaking he was interviewing someone, it doesn't even matter who, saying, Richard, the shrillness of the rhetoric, a vice president of the United States screaming that, Al Gore screaming, Bush betrayed America. Are we taking limited resources and the president and his cabinet have to spend all that time fighting politically when they ought to be focused on World War III? It's time that we unite as a country using this latest beheading as an example that we have been warned. They want to kill us all. Lewis, no mention of George W. Bush bearing any responsibility, yet now it is Dick Cheney, it is all of the right-wingers on Fox News, it is Rush Limbaugh, everybody blaming Obama. He's not doing enough to stop the beheadings, or it's the climate he created that's responsible for the beheadings. Lewis, I'm shocked. Yet another right-wing media double standard.
I think, of course, there was still much less of that coming from the right during Bush's administration. Pointing the finger at Bush, but in general, I think people like to have a scapegoat. There's not really much talk that decades of our foreign policy might have had something to do with this. But
by the way, George W. Bush's specific decision to go into Iraq.
Of course, it was huge. Yeah, we just need to point the finger, and there's no easier person to point the finger at than the president.
I've talked for a long time about my concerns about the relationship, the friendly relationship, the allied relationship between the United States and the theocracy of Saudi Arabia, a country that is backwards on women's rights, it's backward on LGBT rights, it's backwards on democracy. The U.S. does maintain a very friendly relationship with Saudi Arabia, in part because of their natural resources, and not so much because we need Saudi Arabian oil, but more because we want to work with Saudi Arabia to ensure that oil prices are stable. We also have the history of a very strong joint opposition to communism, for example, with Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, it is time to end this relationship. We see day after day of criticism of the beheadings that have taken place in Iraq at the hands of ISIS, and very little discussion of the fact that in August, 19 people were beheaded by the government of Saudi Arabia as death penalty punishment, in some cases, not even for violent crimes. Not that I'm advocating a beheading death penalty for violent crimes. I don't want to make that claim. It's obviously not my point of view. But even for crimes that don't involve violence, non-violent offenses like sorcery. Lewis, Saudi Arabia beheaded someone for sorcery or the dark arts, and they're an ally.
Well, how can we sever these ties when we are completely dependent on oil that we are getting from Saudi Arabia?
Well, but hold on, Lewis. We get some oil from Saudi Arabia, but it's not nearly as much as people think. We get a lot of oil from Canada. We actually do have domestic oil. We get oil from other places. We do get some oil from Saudi Arabia, but we actually would be okay without Saudi Arabian oil. The issue is if Saudi Arabian oil becomes unreliable or unstable because of insecurity, it would affect the oil market, and that really would be bad for the United States.
Well, I mean, do we want to start drilling here because we want to get off of start drilling more here because we want to get off of Saudi oil? I mean, of course,
I
I
don't.
guess maybe that's another discussion. But of course, I would like to sever these ties and have nothing to do with this country. It's sad, but we still have presidents, shaking hands and kissing and hugging these royal idiots.
Well, I mean, I actually don't think they're idiots. They've actually gotten a really great situation for themselves. They can
Yeah,
behead
well,
people.
I mean, most of them were born into that situation.
They can have their religious theocracy and still maintain ties with the United States. Meanwhile, the Cuban embargo continues because, ladies and gentlemen, Cuba, which we have this embargo that dates back to the Cold War. We can't do any business with Cuba, Lewis, but with Saudi Arabia, hey, it's okay.
Just wait until we discover those huge natural gas reserves under Cuba. Things are going to change real quick.
Let's take a break. We'll speak to Dr. Gad Saad next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Gad Saad. He is professor of marketing at Concordia University and also author of The Consuming Instinct and the Evolutionary Bases of Consumption. So I think the obvious place to start is, what are we talking about when we say an evolutionary basis of consumption? And what is the definition of consumption that we're working with? Is it just buying stuff?
Right. Well, thank you first for having me. I'm very much looking forward to it. So I define consumption very broadly. It's not just the act of purchasing something. So it's not, consuming Starbucks and Coca-Cola, but we also consume religious narratives. We consume friendships. We consume marriages. And so I define consumption very, very broadly. And then the evolutionary part is that I argue that there are these evolutionary or Darwinian biological underpinnings that drive much of what we do as consumers. So yes, the Peruvian and Nigerian and Japanese consumer might be in part shaped by their environment, but they also have many things that are similar across these people precisely because they share a biological heritage.
So we could say that culture is a social construction, a societal construction, but that it's somewhat constrained maybe by the biology of humans?
Right. So E.O. Wilson has a great quote. I won't quote the whole thing, but he basically says that the genes hold culture on a leash. So yes, cultures can take on different forms, but they can take on these different forms within biological limits. So, for example, there is no culture that's ever been uncovered where women are taught to be more sexually unrestrained than men. So it would be quite a coincidence if it were just due to random socialization, why we wouldn't find a single culture where this pattern of sexual behavior would be reversed. Well, it isn't reversed because there are biological reasons as to why there might be differences when it comes to human sexuality across the two sexes. So you're exactly right.
So let's talk a little bit. I think we have some really interesting examples for the audience to kind of get them thinking about the type of work that you do. One of these is something you call Darwinian gastronomy, and it relates to the cuisines of different regions. So tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So this is actually a research program that was developed by a gentleman at Cornell, and the reason why I love to use this example is because it actually attacks this idea that evolutionary psychologists don't appreciate the value of culture. It's actually quite the contrary to that. So if you look at the amount of spices that are used across culture, how much salt is consumed across culture, whether we use smoking or pickling across culture, all of these culinary traditions, which are very different across cultures, are actually a manifestation of an adaptation to a local environment. So it turns out, for example, that the more pathogens, more food pathogens there are in a particular cultural environment, the more likely the culinary tradition will include spices, precisely because spices contain an antimicrobial property to basically cater to these food pathogens. So contrary to what a cultural anthropologist would do, which is simply revel at identifying all of these cross-cultural differences and ending the discussion there, what an evolutionary perspective does is it tries to ask, well, why would these cultural differences have arisen?
Can we make predictions using this model? In other words, could we say, let's evaluate what the effect on the species of seafood that we would have access to if climate change continues to have X or Y effect, and then actually use such a theory to speculate about how that might change the cuisine of a location?
I mean, that's a good question. I guess that it would depend on, the amount of time that would be required for that particular trait to be selected. So we know now that there's a varying rate at which different traits are selected, right? So the fact that you have 5 fingers on your hand is now a fixed trait, right? That doesn't vary across cultures. On the other hand, whether you have a gene that permits you to digest lactase, right, or lactose, that itself is something that's due to cultural evolution, and it can actually evolve quite rapidly. So to answer your question, I guess the answer would be it depends on which trait you're looking at, and then I think you could make some rough prediction as to how long it would take for that trait to evolve.
Let's talk about two studies that you've done. One relates to women and one relates to men. Let's start first with women. The female menstrual cycle and its connection to consumption behavior. What have you explored there?
Right. So I wanted to find a phenomenon that would make it difficult for social constructivists, so the folks who think that everything is due to socialization. So I wanted to find a phenomenon that would make it difficult for them to argue, oh, well, it's just due to learning and socialization. And if you're going to do that, then look for phenomena that are really rooted in our basic physiology. And so in the context of the menstrual cycle, we know that there are many cousin species, many mammal species, where the females, once they are in estrus, when they are in heat, will engage in vigorous sexual signaling. For example, their genitalia become engorged. They send out olfactory signals that are quite attractive to men. Well, fortunately, in the human context, it's not quite as conspicuous. But I reasoned that women too should have evolved this propensity to augment their sexual signaling as a function of where they are in their menstrual cycle. And so what I did is a study with a former doctoral student of mine where we tracked women's behaviors for 35 contiguous days. 35 days because that pretty much covers any menstrual cycle length. The average menstrual cycle is about 28 days. And so what we did is we kept track of how they changed their beautification practices, how they changed their food acquisition behaviors as a function of where they are in their menstrual cycle. And what we found is that when women are ovulating, so when they are at the fertile phase of their cycle, this is where they engage in the most vigorous forms of sexual signaling. They're more likely to wear high heels. They're more likely to wear makeup, dress in a more scantily clad manner. So again, they don't do this consciously, but of course, evolution would have built a desire for them either to augment, accentuate, or reduce their desire to show off themselves.
Now, how do you know that they don't do it consciously, right? I mean, in other words, in spite of the fact that probably most women are not thinking in these terms, it's not secret or difficult to ascertain information how your fertility relates to where you are in your menstrual cycle, right? Isn't it possible that at least for some of the women, this was a conscious thing?
Well, it's conscious perhaps in the sense that, look, if we know that women will feel more or less bloated at different points of their menstrual cycle. Their self-esteem goes up or down depending on where they are in their menstrual cycle. So in that sense, it's conscious in that you might say, well, today I don't feel sexy, or today I feel very sexy. I feel as though I'm slim, I'm trim. I'd like to show off my body. But I don't think it's conscious in the sense that they understand the ultimate Darwinian cause, right? They don't say, let me dress provocatively today because I am at the maximal point of my menstrual cycle.
And the connection of that to the perpetuation of the species, right? They're not necessarily thinking of that.
Well, right, exactly. They're not thinking about it from a conscious reproductive goal. In the same way that, all of us have a sense that, our breathing is an adaptation, yet we don't necessarily breathe with an understanding of, what are the exact adaptive mechanisms that would have resulted in our capacity to breathe. So in that sense, it's subconscious.
And then the last one I want to talk about is a study involving men, and it's men and testosterones, and interestingly enough, the connection to the prestige associated with the vehicle they're driving. Is that right?
Right, very good. So here the idea was, there's this concept called lekking behavior. A lek, L-E-K, is a zoological term that is used in animal behavior that captures a physical place where typically males, let's say male birds, will go to show off some feature. And the females sit around the sled, and then they will pick some optimal male, the guy who's got the most beautiful sound, the biggest tail, and so on, so on, so on. And so reasoning along lines, I argued that, well, consumers ultimately engage in lecking behavior. So when it comes to male lecking behavior, we know that men are much more likely to show off status products. 99% of Ferrari owners in North America are male, even though there are many women who could otherwise afford a Ferrari. And so with that reasoning in mind, I thought, well, we know that if you and I, for example, have a fight, and if you beat me up, your testosterone will go up and my testosterone will go down, right? An increase in status increases testosterone, a decrease in status decreases testosterone. So I thought, well, why don't we bring some men and have them drive either a Porsche fancy car or some beaten up old sedan, either in downtown Montreal where everybody could see that I'm a winner or loser, or on some semi-deserted highway. And at the end of each of these conditions, we're going to collect salivary assays to then measure their fluctuating rates of testosterone. And we found, as you might expect, that once you put a young male in a Porsche, his endocrinological system completely goes wild, and he has a big drop, rise in testosterone.
And what was interesting was that it didn't actually matter whether people observed them driving the car or not. Is that right? In other words, my expectation would be, well, it's connected to people observing you driving the car. And it turns out whether they were downtown or in the boonies, it didn't make a difference.
That's exactly right. And your expectation is exactly the one that we also started off with, right? I mean, I'm showing off to an audience, right? The goal of my showing off is not to just show off to myself. And so we thought that in the semi-deserted highway, the testosterone rises would be a lot lesser than in downtown Montreal. But to our surprise, and as you correctly pointed out, it did not matter. Put the young male in a Porsche and he's good to go.
So we've been speaking with Professor Gad Saad. I would encourage our audience to check out the work that he's done and the studies he's done, and email in and let us know what specific topics we should have him back on to talk about. And you'll see if you check out his newsletter. Your newsletter has a good name, and it's escaping me right now. What is it?
Oh, are you talking about the YouTube channel?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, The Sad Truth.
No, not that one. But it's Homo.
Homo Consumericus. That's my Psychology Today blog, where I talk about all sorts of issues. I mean, some consumer issues, but I cover religion, politics. I'm all over the place. So I do hope that they'll check it out.
Right. So check it out. Let us know what topics you'd like to have us talk with Dr. Saad about, and we will absolutely do that. Pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much for having me on. Cheers.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We did a segment a few months back, might even have been a year ago at this point. Don't know if you remember it. It was a clip of Pat Robertson's 700 Club show. And a woman had written in saying, we're having financial problems, we're having medical problems that are expensive. We do tithe, we do donate to our church, but it's really becoming a bit of a burden. We're trying to figure out what to do. And Pat Robertson gave them the advice of definitely don't stop the tithing, because if you tithe, that's your responsibility to God. People who tithe don't have financial or medical problems. Of course, the fact that that woman was tithing and had financial and medical problems was a direct counterexample to Pat Robertson's claim. We now have an even more, I would call it cruel, example of Pat Robertson on the 700 Club telling a viewer that they need to continue tithing even though it is causing a serious problem for them. This is an email from an 80-year-old who is, who along with her, I believe the email is from the woman, and she writes about both herself and her husband. They're having financial issues, they are having medical issues, and they want to know what about the tithing? I know you know what's coming. It's going to be bad. Let's take a look.
This is Audrey, who says, my husband and I are in our 80s and have been tithing for many years. We both love the Lord and give willingly, and our tithe is over 10%. I praise him and thank him for our blessings. I declare that this is our time of prosperity, but we never have an extra money after our monthly bills are paid. Our old car just broke down and we had to borrow money to fix it. We both need dental work, but we can't afford it. I constantly have to use our credit card to pay for medical needs. I speak the verse about, quote, give and it will be given to you. We have no unforgiveness in our lives. What could we be doing wrong?
Well, why don't you ask God to show you some ways of making money? You know, there are many ways of making money, even at 80 years old. You know, you can get on the telephone and people are hiring. There are all kinds of things you can do. Think of ways. I mean, for example, you may have a bunch of junk lying around in your garage that you can sell on eBay and get some money. I mean, there are many, many ways of making money, and you're looking at the downside of all the bills you've got. And instead of saying, God, now I've been faithful to you, now I claim my blessing, and I ask you to open the windows of heaven and pour me out a blessing.
80-plus-year-old couple, broken car that they can't afford to fix, dental work that they can't afford to pay for that's not being done, charging their medical bills to a credit card, in part because they're now giving more than 10% of their income to their church. And Pat Robertson says, have God tell you how to make money, sell your trinkets on eBay, but keep tithing and going to church because God will help you find the money. This is a sickening, disgusting, immoral piece of advice. And, you know, there's not even a senior discount from God that Pat Robertson can just make up in his fantasy world.
I'd love to hear how this couple responded to Pat Robertson's response to their question.
If this is even a real email, which of course we've seen that fake emails do get through, but I take it at its value.
Yeah, I mean, there are trolls all the time. Maybe it is real, but his advice certainly is real.
You know,
and it's pretty sickening.
You know what Pat Robertson should have told him, Lewis? Here's what you should do. The best way I know of for 80-plus-year-olds to make money is host a television show where you convince people that there's a magical, invisible being that's communicating through you, and that the right thing to do based on what that invisible being says is to send the TV host your money. Pat Robertson, who's in his 80s, has perfected that.
He is the master, and I'm not sure what kind of car he drives, but he probably doesn't drive at all. He probably has a driver. But that's one way to do it. But of course, it takes years to develop that whole thing.
It's amazing to me that Pat Robertson's program airs on channels that are supposedly family-oriented. I can think of nothing more cruel than telling an 80-year-old couple that they either need to get back to work, which was the other idea, have God help you figure out what jobs are available, get back to work, or sell your personal belongings, maybe some of which you hoped would stay in your family. I don't know. I mean, you have worked your whole life. But don't stop tithing in spite of the fact that your dental work is going undone.
If they ask Pat Robertson for advice, he'll put them to work. If they ask Mitt Romney for advice, he'll tell them to borrow money from their parents. What do you do?
Yeah, or he should have added that. By the way, this is an idea from my buddy Mitt Romney. Just borrow money from your parents. If you're 80 and you need dental work and you're spending too much at your church, just get money from your parents. Your parents always have money. Amazing. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or criticisms about this program, you can call our voicemail number. The number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is one that fits into that latter category, Lewis, of critiques. Let's take a listen.
Yeah, free speech my ass. Let people call in and give their advice. Then it'd be free speech, you communist bastard.
Okay, well, by the way, I picked up on a slight Boston accent there, and it brought me back, Lewis, to going to Boston sports events and hearing the same types of critiques yelled at Derek Jeter typically. And it is in fact someone from the Boston area who called in who's not happy with us. I mean, you just called in. We have a voicemail number. To call in and leave a voicemail critiquing that we don't have a call-in number is weird because you're leaving us that information on the call-in number. And your voicemail just went to air. So I guess, Lewis, now is that free speech?
Also, you are free to start your own show and tell people about what you think about everything. And so then this will even out.
On today's bonus show, do not pants an off-duty U.S. Marshal. It is a bad idea. Also, cardboard license plates don't fool anybody. and restorers have destroyed the world's oldest pyramid. What is that all about? Lewis will tell us about that and more. And David Attenborough wants to find a Yeti. How do you get access to the bonus show? Go to davidpakman.com/membership. Not only will you access the bonus show, an extra 15-minute show in addition to every day's free show, you will also get access to the commercial-free podcast feed, an archive of our shows that dates back to August of 2005, and you will be invited to the David Pakman Show members-only town hall video conferences with Lewis and with me. davidpakman.com/membership. Talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.